You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
The foundation invests a lot in data, working to generate the evidence that will help to show decision makers that it actually makes sense to invest in women from a business perspective. So it's not just being charitable and helping them out. 40% of government procurement will go to women-owned, women-led businesses. We do have a number of initiatives that we are supporting to increase women's economic power. While some progress has been made, there are still significant disparities in women's economic participation across the African continent.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Rachel Toku-Appiah, who is the Director of Program Advocacy and Communications for Africa at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel. How are you?
I am very well, thank you, Tessa. Thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. So, where are you today?
Today, I'm actually in Abuja, meeting with some of our partners.
My second home, Abuja. So, yes, it's been, I actually visited last year, but spent many years in my youth living in Abuja.
Great. Did you see any major changes?
Funny enough, the last time I visited was last year, and that was the first time in quite a while, because most times when I visit Nigeria, I go to Lagos. There's a lot of change. Obviously, the city has expanded phenomenally from when I remember as a child. It's grown a lot.
Well, we hope to help support continued change in a positive direction through our work.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it during our conversation. So, as always, I like to start from the beginning, so I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Rachel Toku-Appiah.
Great. No, thank you. So, as I said, I'm Rachel Toku-Appiah, born in Ghana. I actually grew up in Botswana, did all my primary, secondary, first degree there, postgrad in the UK, worked in the US and in several countries in Africa. But I had the benefit of growing up in a family where not only was I afforded every opportunity my siblings had, regardless of whether they were boys or girls, but my parents actually had me because they really wanted another girl. Yeah. And so it's only when I grew up that I actually realized some of the challenges that other women across the continent face. And I've just been very passionate about working to help level the playing field, recognizing that no one chooses which country, which community, which family to be born into. And so if we can give everyone access to opportunities to develop to their full potential around health, around education, and economic opportunities later in life, this is what drives me. This is what I'm passionate about and what I hope to contribute to achieving in my current role at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. So let's get straight into it in terms of your work as Director of Program Advocacy and Communications at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. How do you perceive the current landscape of women's economic empowerment in sub-Saharan Africa?
While some progress has been made, there are still significant disparities in women's economic participation across the African continent. And increasing women's inclusion and participation in society is just critical for driving progress and prosperity in Africa. We know that some of the things we know right now is, when women control household incomes, their children's health improves, malnutrition is reduced, by up to 43%. This was in an FAO report. And a recent study in Malawi has found that investing in women's economic power enhances school progression and completion rates and can contribute to human capital development in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is because, when mothers have more financial autonomy, they're more likely to invest in their children's nutrition and well-being and take primary responsibility for their children's education. So we still have some significant gaps in terms of women's economic participation, and particularly around access to finance. We know, for example, that women business owners in sub-Saharan Africa receive only 15% of loans issued to small and medium-sized businesses. And women business owners, in South Asia, it's another continent, but really just illustrating that this is not just an African challenge, but extends beyond. So women business owners in South Asia receive just under 10% of financing that is given to small and medium-owned businesses. So this just gives you an indication that there's still a lot of work to be done.
As you've mentioned, progress has been made, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And you've touched on some key points and statistics. And I know you're quite passionate about financial access. So maybe if we look at financial access specifically when it comes to digital financial services, what role do you think that can play in bridging the financial gap specifically for women entrepreneurs in Africa?
It can play a huge role in the sense that if we're able to set up digital public infrastructure in our countries that facilitates women's financial inclusion, it can help build trust, first of all, between citizens, between governments, between financial institutions such as the bank. It is something that is accessible just because of the extensive reach that digital has these days. We know that mobile phone use has seen and continues to see a significant increase in the African continent, though there's still more to be done for women's financial access. But we saw even during the pandemic that many countries whose citizens were able to weather it better, were able to do so because of digital financial payments to support them, social support payments. We also know that digital, again, because of its extensive reach, women don't necessarily have to go far, to travel far, to access physical institutions. I know of models in places where there are women that actually take the financial services to rural communities and provide those services using a smartphone. And so it just makes it much more accessible. And it's even better, of course, if we're able to link this to a national ID system. It gives the women control over their finances. The resources come directly to them. One other thing that it does is when women are able to save money because of digital financial accounts, what happens is that they're able over time to demonstrate that they have resources. It's able to give them access to finance in ways that they couldn't have before. Right now, many women that are unbanked are keeping their money with them. Not only does this not help when they're trying to access finance, but putting that money in an account, if you were able to pool all those resources that are with so many women that are doing businesses and are not able to bank it, that also creates a pool of resources that other women can access to fuel growth of their businesses. So it really has wide-ranging impact in terms of inclusion, from women in the city to women in rural areas. And perhaps I can illustrate with, an example where I currently live in South Africa, and I have family members that live in a rural community in Ghana.
Yeah.
I'm able to transfer funds from a regular account onto what they call a mobile money account, a MOMO account, and transfer that to the family member on the phone, and they're able to access it. So just the resources are much more accessible now as a result.
So from your experience, what would you say are some of the key challenges that you've encountered in promoting financial inclusion for women in Africa?
One of the big challenges is around perception or misconception, where women, for some reason, are perceived to be not as good, to be riskier than men. And yet the evidence shows that women actually pay back loans much better. And so, the foundation invests a lot in data, really working to generate the evidence that will help to show decision makers that it actually makes sense to invest in women. It makes sense from a business perspective. So it's not just being charitable and helping them out. It's actually good for financial institutions to provide women with access to finance. And then it has a multiplier effect in terms of the benefits to women. The other thing is really around women in leadership. Women bring in valuable perspectives and solutions to leadership roles, and yet they remain underrepresented in positions of power. So in terms of the people making the decisions, if we had more women in some of these roles as well, they understand the unique perspectives of women. They also understand, because they have the lived experience to be able to help the decisions that are made around women's access to finance land in a better place. And so, it's around data, it's around women in leadership, in decision-making places. Also the challenge around assets.
Yes.
The age-old challenge of wanting physical assets as a prelude to being able to access finance. And we know that some of the cultural norms and practices that make it challenging for women to own land and to have, the typical assets that are required by traditional financial institutions is another barrier that we have encountered. And one way that we know, and this I can give an example that I actually saw in action during a trip to India, was where they form women's collectives. So they come together to actually borrow financing and support each other in terms of the usage, the reporting, encouragement around paying back and so on. And this, is something that the financial institutions have been comfortable with. And over time, the women are able to graduate as they grow their businesses and build those kinds of assets, able to access financing on their own versus in a collective.
As you mentioned, a challenge is the perception of women being risky in terms of receiving financial investment or support. Can you share specific initiatives or programs that the foundation is involved in to address these challenges?
Yes. So, we are supporting initiatives that empower women economically, but also including digital financial tools and skills development programs. An example is the EquiFarm digital platform in Kenya. It supports women agricultural workers to access financial products and to develop their financial literacy to build financial resilience against external shocks. One of the challenges that we've seen is despite double-digit growth in mobile phone ownership across Africa, only 12% of women possess digital finance knowledge and communications technology skills. And so through that particular initiative, we're supporting them not only to access the financial products, but equipping them with those skills, the financial literacy, to be able to build resilience against shocks. We've also seen the widespread adoption of mobile money in the Kenya markets. With M-Pesa, this has increased savings, enabled women to start businesses, helping to reduce the number of households living in extreme poverty. In Ethiopia, we're partnering with Ethiopia Telecom and Safaricom to really invest in women when they're able to come up with ideas that will accelerate or support women-led businesses. They're able to access financing, which is digital finance. They access it that way. They're able to distribute it through these channels to actually deliver their business. And so we do have a number of initiatives that we are supporting to just increase women's economic power across the continent.
Fantastic. So if we move from the foundation's initiatives or programs and look closer at your role, I was wondering if you could elaborate in terms of your role at the foundation and how that role works to facilitate the successful implementation and delivery of these initiatives.
Thank you. So my role when it comes to program advocacy and communications is really to be able to take this evidence. I spoke earlier about the misconceptions around risk when it comes to women. It's to really take data that addresses things like that, but also data that shows the impact when women are given access to finance, the kind of personal financial growth that they see, and also how that then contributes when you look at the multiplier effect, the potential it has to increase, a community or a country's economic growth. So it's sharing that evidence. It's also really working to demonstrate or some of the policies that need to be in place to facilitate that. Sometimes change is not going to happen, simply because you've shared the evidence, obviously. You may need a national policy that mandates women, in South Africa, for example, where there's a government policy that basically states that 40% of government procurement will go to women-owned, women-led businesses. So there are times when we also demonstrate how policies in particular geographies have helped to accelerate. It's first equipping the governments or our government partners or other stakeholders with the information that they need to, first of all, acknowledge and realize that this is doable, this has positive benefits, but then it's also around providing technical assistance to enable them to do it. One way to do this at scale is to have the digital public infrastructure, which private sector can then build use cases on top of, whether it is around supporting women in agribusiness or women in other kinds of business initiatives, supporting them to, have bank accounts to start with. So we have investments in partners that can help with that. We have partners such as African Nenda or Better Than Cash, who are working and available to help, whether it's government partners or other institutions, to be able to build digital public infrastructure, looking at things like the interoperable instant payment systems, looking at the regulatory framework, because we also know that you need to have safeguards in place to engage safely, online. Looking at the ID system, for example, the digital ID, when everyone, has a digital, unique ID that can be linked to these digital accounts. And so these are some of the things that we have in place. We know we're working on the data. We're working with partners that are made available. but really providing supports around what policies need to be in place, what regulatory frameworks need to be in place, and then actually to the technical aspects. There are partners that will support around training. When you actually set up these systems, who's actually going to maintain it,
Yes.
and keep it working and grow it. So on multiple levels, that is the work that I'm involved in. And obviously the financing as well.
Brilliant.
All of this requires resourcing.
Yeah.
So how do we make the connections to donor partners, development partners, or help governments as well? Where do you access the financing from, or tap into private sector to be able to develop and expand these initiatives?
You talked about using accurate data to almost tell a story and share evidence. So, since you've been involved in the social development space in Africa, how have you seen it develop?
I see significant impact, right? When it comes to, and again, when I'm talking about digital, when it comes to digital health, in Rwanda, for example, they have an initiative there that allows people to access health digitally. So again, it makes it more accessible. They're able to triage. When you call in, you're able to speak to a qualified medical professional. It avoids the additional time required if you were traveling physically to a facility, waiting in a queue for long periods of time. You're able, when you get a diagnosis or if they are recommended for tests to a lab facility that's close to you, you're able to pick up your prescription somewhere, closer to you. So these progress that I see, while not, widespread across the continent, I see progress that can really help this continent leapfrog, so to speak, using digital infrastructure. I do feel that there needs to be a more targeted focus, an intentional focus on women. The commitments are there, but translating those commitments into actions that then impact lives, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And it's really to say, if as a continent we saw, progress under the MDGs, we've seen some progress, but we know that we're not in a good space when it comes to the SDGs. And we can really turn that around if we're able to be very intentional about investing in women's economic power, in women's health, in women's agency. I think we will see significant progress on many aspects of the SDGs. So I've seen progress over the years since I've worked in the development space. I mean, we see many more women in leadership positions, but we all know that we still have a long way to go. Even if you look at the top leadership, on the continent in terms of heads of states, again, there's a huge gap there in terms of having women in those leadership positions. We've seen significant improvements at national levels in terms of representation in parliament, but again, in many countries, there's still a long way to go. We've seen it in the health space where you have so many women in the health sector, but as you get to the top echelons, you find that there are much fewer women. So significant, I think, room for improvement.
So, what more do you think can be done to further progress the development space in Africa?
It's really about action. I think we need to start doing in terms of what we've committed to. And this is where sometimes it is figuring out just what to do. And so facilitating cross-learning across the continent. There are countries that have done well in one area. So the Rwanda example, to say they've done this well. The work that's been done in Kenya, when it comes to using digital technology to expand access to finance and to grow businesses. When we look at the work that is being done in Ethiopia now, I think it's really about buckling down and saying, this is what we want to do, but how do we do it? What are all the key elements, right? It's not just about, okay, fine, we want to give women access to digital finance. What needs to be in place? Who needs to actually do it? Do we have those people? Are there gaps? How do we build the capacity, or how do we fill the gaps? What is the actual infrastructure that needs to be in place? How much will it cost? How do we get the resources to fund that? In terms of the user, the use and the demand, how do we make sure that there's adequate demand that will sustain this? I think it's about doing it, and it's about learning from each other. One of the areas that we're working on is around South-South collaboration, as we're terming it, where countries in the Global South can learn from other countries in the Global South that may have similar contexts in which they're encountering these challenges, but have addressed it and really use that as an avenue to get practical. That, I think, for me, is the biggest challenge, is to move from, there's still some strengthening of policies and regulations, especially because some technologies are newer, right? And there may not be existing policies that support that. So there is that element, updating policies. But the doing aspect, the implementation, that is where I see a need to focus more, and also developing that culture of making decisions based on data, because it can really inform us in a context where we have limited resources to make the best use of those resources, because we have data that shows us what works. What is the best way to reach women, for example? What are their particular needs? What kind of support do they need? If we have all that evidence and we're able then to invest the limited resources we have in a targeted way to get the maximum impacts we can with that, I foresee accelerated growth.
As you mentioned, it's about action, and understanding what to do requires partnership. So how important are partnerships and local organizations for the delivery of the work that you're doing?
Partnerships are critical. And obviously, as the Melinda Gates Foundation, we work with so many partners across the continent, recognizing we can't possibly have the kind of reach that we need to have the kind of impact that we want without those. And it's about partnerships with a range of stakeholders. So partnerships with people that have people and organizations that have the technical knowledge, the expertise around these issues, and local partners that really understand the context. Digital solutions, one of the key elements for success is that it must be contextualized. We know that issues, landscapes, there are differences, from country to country. And so being able to work with local partners that have that understanding is critical. The fact that we want to scale, and in order to go to scale, the natural partner is the government. So working with governments as well. So partnerships are key. So even as we say action and understanding what needs to be done, that understanding sits with partners, right? With different stakeholders. And how do we bring all those people together to really say, how are we collectively going to drive this? Who is going to take which piece? So that when we all come together, we're able to achieve this shared objective.
Thank you for that. You slightly touched on this in terms of what ways do you collaborate with African governments and policymakers to create that enabling environment for women entrepreneurs in terms of financial access and digital inclusion?
So one way we work with them is really around supporting them to develop, whether it's the policy supporting around coordination. So perhaps I can use an example, here in Nigeria, where I am today, where the foundation provided support to develop a women's economic policy and set up structures that would facilitate oversight, coordination, and drive implementation of that. And it really brought together, it's not just us, but other partners that are interested in women's economic empowerment to provide the collective resourcing and supports that would help to do that. It has to be government-led, it's a government policy, but bringing together other partners. So those are some of the ways where the support we provide can be around the TA that may be required to develop a policy, or it can be supports that is required to facilitate coordination so that we are working collectively. There isn't duplication, but complementarity, and making the best use of resources, pulling in and crowding in resources to deliver. And again, it's also around the cross-learning. Work that we are doing in Kenya, for example. Kenya has been working on a care policy. We know that one of the challenges around women's full economic participation is around providing safe, affordable care for children, and how do we put that in place? Just putting in place the support structures that would enable women to fully participate. And it's not just doing it for women, but it's also an economic sector, right?
Yes.
There is a care economy. And so looking at what has been done in Kenya and saying, is that something because, as the foundation providing support in multiple countries and being aware of that, can we connect to countries so that they can learn from each other to be able to strengthen the supports mechanisms and the policies and implementation of policies that advance women's economic power?
I guess with all the work that you're doing, it is about creating impact. You've touched on collecting data, but I was wondering if you can expand on the ways that you measure the effectiveness and impact of your programs, specifically the ones aimed at advancing women's economic power.
So when you look at our focus areas for our gender equality work, women's economic power is a key pillar. Women in leadership is another pillar. But we also have a data pillar, which is really looking to help countries collect data in a gender disaggregated way so we can actually see how implementation of policies is impacting women and to track it. There is a lot of work still to be done around that. There's also using existing reports around gender equality that allow us to track women's economic progress. But I say that this is still a work in progress in terms of really trying to make this systematic in terms of how we're collecting data. And so in our initiatives, working to build M&E into that in a way that will allow us to compile the data that shows, yes, we're having that impact, we're making the progress, but also, as I shared earlier, if we are not moving in the direction that we'd like, what are the reasons? How do we course correct or adapt based on what the data is telling us? But I think it's a huge, huge area when it comes to data systems across the continent. And again, digital technology has the potential to strengthen data collection and the quality of data that we have, as well as analysis of that data and its subsequent dissemination in a timely manner to really support decision-making in the work that we're doing.
Yeah. As you say, it's a work in progress, but I was wondering, do you have any specific figures that you can share that demonstrate some recent impact that you've made?
There's always a challenge that we have when it comes to contribution and attribution. And so, I'd be wary of saying we've done X and this is the impact that we as the foundation have been able to have. Because even in the examples I gave or around the We policy in Nigeria, yes, the foundation provided support to enable the TA, provided support around coordination, but there are multiple other partners that are involved in financing. There's also other partners that provide technical support. And so I'd be wary of saying we've done X and, as the foundation, this is the impact that we have been able to achieve. But what I can tell you is if I look at the Kenyan example of Equifarm digital platform, like we see and we can tell stories. I think it's better told in the stories, in the lives of individual women, where you can see a woman who was struggling to feed the family, struggling with the kids, keeping kids in school. And we can see that as a result of the initiative, they've now got healthy children, they're in school, they're working well, and they have increased outputs, productivity on their farms. So those kinds of impact we have definitely seen. And you'll find some of those stories of change, on the foundation's website around these women that we've supported in different ways and how their lives have been transformed.
So you've shared some great insights and case studies or examples of the impact, the work or the initiatives that the foundation and its partners have delivered. So I guess if we look at those impacts, some of that impact creates trends. So are there any trends that you're seeing in terms of the advancement of women's economic power in Africa that you're currently happy or excited about?
I think the trends that I am seeing, and I don't know, it's around some of the practical policies, right? Putting in place a policy that says 40% of procurement, government procurement, should go to women-owned or women-led businesses is something that's very practical and also measurable, right? For a country to be able to say, A, we're succeeding or not. And so, yes, we've seen it in one country, but this is something that started at a continental level. When President Ramaphosa was the African Union chair a few years ago, this was women's economic power was something that was a priority for him. And so at the AU level, I believe the figure is 30% procurement. And in South Africa, they went a step further. And we're seeing that, in other countries. So I think this is something that is encouraging. But we know that, so when you have this sort of the policy framework and you start to see other countries adopting it, which is great, though we know that there's work then to be done to actually make it happen, to support women-owned businesses, to help identify them. They may not be on the radar of, procurement officers. And again, back to this issue of access to finance that enables them to fulfill some of those procurement tenders. So that's something that I'm seeing that is positive. There is definitely more conversation, I think, around it, even now, where we've had this month, International Women's Day, and their conversations. I see certainly much more communication around women and women leaders in a way that perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago wasn't there. I see more conversations around women who have significant businesses. So I see a trend where it's not talking just about access to microfinance, but there are women with businesses that, are medium-sized and are thriving. And so there's more profiling. I think so women's voices, women's agency has improved, even though, and as I said, in terms of a trend around getting more women in leadership, I see some encouraging developments around that. So I see progress around women using digital technology, right? Using mobile phones to access information like agricultural extension, when to plant, what kind of crops to plant at a particular time, information about markets, so strengthening access to markets, all that. I'm seeing more of that in a way that wasn't there before. I'm seeing more women have agency over their own finance because of the digital finance. Yeah.
If we move past current trends and look at the future, the future of Africa, in the next 5 years, where do you see or how do you see women's economic power shifting through financial access?
I see it shifting. I mean, it would be a game changer if you were to give women access to finance. We have so many women-owned businesses. Unfortunately, many of them are in the informal sector. It would bring them into the formal sector. It would enabling them to have greater control, autonomy over their own finances, the knock-on effects that we know happen in terms of family health, education, community development when women have access to finance. It would just be a huge game changer. If we could give basically half of our potential workforce the same access to finance that men have, we would see accelerated development. We see that they pay back. They do pay back the finance, and in many instances better than men-owned businesses. And giving them that access to digital finance, can you imagine if you bring them into the formal sector? Even the ability to tax, right, increases domestic resource mobilization, formalizing their businesses. So in the next 5 years, if this continent could significantly increase access to finance for women, give them the digital financial literacy that they need, I see the continent significantly on the economic front.
I agree. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 5 years' time? What impactful work will you be doing on the continent?
I hope that in 5 years' time, I won't still have to make the case for why it's a no-brainer to invest in women, to give them the resources that they need. We have started doing more around investing in women's health. There are many health issues unique to women, and it's not just about their reproductive health. We often talk about women's health in that context alone, and it's broader than that. So in 5 years' time, I would like to be able to be working with partners, with governments to deliver effective health solutions for women. I would like to start now with the innovations that are in place, but really to have advanced the needle significantly on that. In 5 years' time, I want to be working on and engaging with women in leadership in ways that I'm not able to now, simply because they haven't been given those opportunities to occupy offices. And dare I say, in 5 years' time, I want to be able to say I don't have to work like crazy, because there is just so much to do in this space. But because the continent has grown so much, because the continent's development trajectory has improved so much, and because others have caught on to the vision that there will be many more Rachels that are actually doing the work.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yes, it's an Akan proverb, and translated into English, it's the right hand washes the left and the left hand washes the right. When you're trying to wash your hands, if you try to wash one hand by itself, get the soap on it and, run, it's actually very difficult to get that hand clean. But when you bring the other hand together with it and rub your hands together and use both hands, you're able to get both hands clean. In order to develop this continent, I think we all need to work together. It's not just the policymakers. It's not just the governments. It's not just development partners or the private sector alone that are going to do it. We actually all need to come together and to support each other. And if we're able to do that, we will be able to achieve this dream of a prosperous Africa in which every African has agency and can develop to the full economic potential. Thank you.
What a fantastic way to end today's conversation. I don't think I could have ended it any more succinctly or beautifully. Thank you for joining us today, Rachel, sharing your insights and expertise in terms of advancing women's economic empowerment in Africa through financial access and digital technologies, and sharing the great work that you're doing at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you too, Tessa.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.